All right. Good afternoon, folks. I'm Bruce Barbarasch, and I am the sustainability manager here for the Park District. I have also been the coordinator for the Healthy Tree Canopy Initiative, which is to this point has been a working group of about 7 or 8 groups, which I'll tell you about in a second. And our big purpose really is to try and look from a broader perspective as what does it look like when we have a healthy canopy here in Washington County. This includes natural areas, it includes developed areas, and sometimes it's really easy to focus on one or the other, but when we have both, we have something that's greater than the sum of its parts. The working group has a nice cross-section of different types of folks, including some folks from private industry as well as a number of public agencies. But there's a lot more room for other partners. We know that not everybody's at the table. And when we're looking at a collective impact model, we're looking broader than just what a couple agencies can do to kind of make a slam dunk, right? We want all boats to kind of float on the high tide, and we're not there yet. But we're starting. And one of the reasons, if you've been here since some of the early meetings, that it feels like we're not moving very fast is because we're moving intentionally, and we're not moving fast because when we move too quick, we miss stuff. So the Healthy Tree Canopy Initiative, that's a really long title. This working group kind of started with these values. Right, we were really like, we're trying to do something important. It transcends in some ways this exact subject. But what we wanted to do was get together and start to answer some of these critical questions about like, well, we say we want a healthy tree canopy. Like, do we already have it? How do we know that? Right? We also didn't want to reinvent a bunch of stuff because there's lots of groups out here already doing things. And we wanted to try and figure out like what are some of those things, and like a really straightforward example of that is we were like, well, we need a climate adapted tree list. Let's start working on that. What trees are working right now? What trees aren't? And it's like, should this group define that? And the answer was one of our members from the Department of Forestry is like, we've already been convening a committee of a whole bunch of other stakeholders, and we're going to have that list in a couple months. So this group was like, okay, we don't need to talk about that right now. We'll wait for the list to come in. We also started to realize that well, 2 things right off. One is like in the old school of defining healthy canopy, and it's not wrong to do this, but folks would often go out and count individual trees, fill out forms, volunteers, staff, whoever would go out and do this stuff. Increasingly, there's a lot of digital tools to evaluate some of this stuff, and so the question became, what's the right measure? We've looked at a whole bunch of digital things that are out there, ranging from the tree mapper to the tree equity score. And we really tried to say like, well, what makes sense for us? And we looked at some really theoretical models. We looked at some things that were a little more practical. And this was the part of the tree list from the Oregon Department of Forestry. They had identified some trees that were specifically really useful for climate adapted, and some others they felt were still good tree choices. So this is kind of a starting point for action, right? The other thing that we talked a fair bit about, and I was glad to have some nursery folks involved, was that like we all go, yeah, let's go plant some climate adapted trees. Well, like how long does it take to identify those trees? And then how long does it take to grow them out to a state where they're actually ready to plant? There's been some other working groups related to this that ask questions like, sure, we'd love to bring some things up from further south in Oregon. What are the pros and cons of doing that? Right? These plants might be happier in a hotter, drier environment, but are they going to bring pathogens? Might they be invasive? Right? So it's kind of one of those things where like, let's do something. And then it's kind of like, well, let's do something smart. Let's do something that makes sense, and what's the right timing for it? The other thing that's possibly even the most important thing is just because I've got $1 million to spend on trees, which I don't, I wish I did, but I can get there if I have buy-in, right? And if I march down the street over here to the Aloha neighborhood and I start plopping trees in the ground, am I going to make a lot of friends? Question is, well, maybe. But what we wanted to do is start to understand some needs out there, right? Some of those were things that we could guess. And so, for example, a number of folks in this room and others working with several different county department of health and a lot of volunteers, we created a heat map to show what does Washington County look like in the hottest part of the summer. And when we look at those red areas, we go, hey, you know what? Those are hot areas. Trees can help cool things off. Trees are one solution to heat. They are not the only solution, right? And so we can at least have a starting point of, hey, maybe we should be talking to the folks in those dark red areas, the hot areas, and say, what are you experiencing? What's going on? Right? Here's some of our partners. How can we help? What we don't want to come in and do is go, hey, we got trees. Who wants a tree? But some of those folks might want trees. And that's how we're going to get to developing programs. The other thing our group realized pretty quick is like, it's easy to buy a tree and it's not even that hard to plant a tree, but it's really hard to sustain a tree. And so we talked a lot about like, what's that process look like and what are the hurdles? And so there were two agency folks who work in the urban environment, one from the city of Hillsborough, and he's a kind of a frontline manager. He had a lot of comments about, well, here's some barriers inside my agency, some challenges I have. And then we try and look at those in other agencies. We go, how do we change that? Some of our partners produced this great report, which looked at the whole metro area. And so there's a lot of information out there, and our group's been trying to synthesize what does that mean, and which of those barriers do we try and address first? How do we involve different folks? And so kind of where this Healthy Canopy group is right now is we've got a bunch of information. And we're really starting to ask the question of how do we involve the broader community? That community involves both like people who live there and may be affiliated with a group, folks who may not be affiliated, right? There's also agencies of various sorts and nonprofits that we just haven't reached out to yet or haven't found us or vice versa. And so we're really, really aware of that. And we also recognize partners don't always come in these really discrete chunks. And that's a struggle. It's also an opportunity, because if we're going to do it right, we need more than just the folks in the room. But you folks are a really excellent starting point because you probably know people, right? You have ideas, you've talked to folks, and so we got to reach out, and that's one thing our group especially recognize. And then the last piece is like, okay, so now we're starting to find some folks to get involved. How do we fund it? And that part, in some ways, I feel like is easier if we have all this other legwork accomplished.